Glace Bay, Digby, Pugwash, and Middleton. There's a shortage of ER doctors in this province, and the problem is only getting worse. Doctors are retiring and continuing to leave the province. The government has no plan to fix this situation, no plan to retain the doctors, no plans for training, no plans to attract other doctors, no plans to help recognize the credentials of foreign-trained doctors who would love to move to this province, no plans to create, fund, or administer any programs that would help our existing doctors fill the vacancies. Please. So my question, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister of Health, what is your government's plan to reduce the number of emergency room closures in this province?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I can say that over the last number of months, and that member has been bringing up to the attention of the House and of Nova Scotians the issue of ER closures. And Mr. Speaker, I can say that the Department of Health takes that to heart in making sure that we can try to find opportunities for foreign-trained doctors, through the IMG program in Yarmouth, through the CAP program, through the College of Physicians and Surgeons. I can say that through investments, we will continue to have more physicians and more emergency specialists in this province. And Mr. Speaker, I can say that over the last number of weeks, I have instructed the department to come up with a strategy for ER closures, and I'm looking forward to that report to come from them.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, this government continues to simply bury its head in the sand and ignore the problem of ER closures in this province. It's not going to go away, Mr. Minister, by simply ignoring it. The problem gets worse every year. Mr. Speaker, we should not stand by and wait until possibly somebody...
Order, please. Sadly, time for question period has expired. The Honourable Government House Leader on Government Business.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to call public bills for third reading.
Public bills for third reading.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to call Bill 117.
Bill 117. The Honourable Member for Halifax-Shabukto.
Mr. Speaker, I beg your pardon. I thought the formal motion needed to be made.
Oh, sorry. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I believe that protocol provides that I move third reading of the bill, and I do so.
The Honourable Member for Halifax-Shabukto on third reading.
All right, good. Mr. Speaker, one of the items I have taped to the door on my office is the front page, page 1 of the Daily News from this past autumn. You may recall that it relates to the process at second reading for Bill 117. This was the item where the headline read, I believe, blah, 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 NDP bores government into submission. Now, I like this particular front page of the Daily News. On the face of it, you might think that it's not very complimentary to my caucus colleagues. But you know, what accompanies that very large headline is a series of 12 head and shoulders photographs of my colleagues, each of whom had spoken at second reading on Bill 117. And accompanying each of these photographs was a short extract from the speeches that they had given. And they were wonderful. They were trenchant comments. They were punchy. They really got to the heart in each instance of some aspect of what was fundamentally wrong and what remains fundamentally wrong with Bill 117. I'm sorry to say that my photograph was not amongst those photos because I hadn't had the opportunity to speak on second reading. The photos were of the 12 of my colleagues who did get that opportunity. In terms of our own internal workings, our own list of who was going to speak and when, my name appeared last. I happened to be at the bottom of the list. I think we were more or less just going through the rows in a back and forth, or to use the the long Greek word boustrophodonical fashion in the rows here, and I happen to be last on the list. My job was, I think, to use the kind of term that my colleague from Timberley Prospect would use. I was going to bat cleanup at the end, but I never got that opportunity. I'm sorry I never did get the opportunity, which is perhaps why I get to speak first this time when it comes to third reading. I just simply have not had previously the opportunity to put into the official record my views on Bill 117. So I'm grateful to have the opportunity to speak, and speak first in the batting order this time. Members who were here during the committee of the whole House on the clause by clause will probably find my remarks familiar. I think I made a number of these comments, perhaps almost all of them, in the committee of the whole House, but of course that's not a Hansard process. It's not one where it's officially on the record. But I do wish to go through what seemed to me to be a series of fundamental objections to this bill. In the end, I can't see that even though there has been some progress on the technical side of amending this bill, that we're any further ahead seriously than we were when we first started out. So I don't find myself persuaded that this bill is the right item. But even before we get into that, I want to deal with the issue of why it is that so much time of this House has been demanded of the members to deal with it. Why are we here in an extraordinary January session to deal with this particular bill? I know many of my colleagues are aware that Nova Scotia has many other more pressing problems than the question of electoral finance. Now, I think electoral finance is something we can turn our minds to. It's something that indeed at some point we should reform. It's something that we should reform in a thoughtful and measured and progressive fashion. It's something that we should have done by consulting the public. You may recall that at an earlier stage in the proceedings, we proposed a 6-month hoist for this bill. We proposed that because it seemed to us that this very useful and important aspect of how the democratic process is organized and funded in Nova Scotia should go out to the public so that they can learn a bit more about it and so that they can give us the benefit of what it is that they know and think about this process. That would have been fine, but unfortunately it didn't happen. There was a combination of the votes of the government and the votes of the third party that blocked that initiative. And that sent us a clear signal, if indeed we needed one after the announcement in the summer session, after the election and after the first budget. If we even needed one, we then knew for sure that something was afoot between the government and the third party, and that part of the arrangement had to do with this bill. It wasn't our choice to move so rapidly or so extensively on this bill. We have a much higher list of priorities. We regard issues around jobs, issues around poverty, issues around the environment, issues around workplace health and safety, issues around the vitality of our rural communities as all being matters that are of much higher importance when it comes to the demands on the attention of our government. But instead of moving ahead in an organized and thorough fashion on some of these issues, what we found is that the government has chosen to put its efforts into a bill that they seem to think will offer them some electoral advantage when the time comes for another provincial election. Now, I think you have to admire the foresight in the sense of the sheer turning of a mind towards a coming problem. But one would wish that the government would take seriously its responsibilities and start thinking about the future for a larger group of people than merely those members of their party assisted by the third party and the hangers-on. Nova Scotia has almost 1 million people, and we have a diversity of problems here. Some are worse than other problems, some not quite so worse, but we have a whole range of problems, some of which I've just enunciated. And there could be initiatives from the government on virtually any of these. And a number of these problems are, in fact, very serious. When I mentioned the question of jobs, I think primarily about the rural areas and areas like Cape Breton and areas like the Cumberland counties and areas like down the South Shore where unemployment rates are much higher than they are certainly in Metro, but certainly throughout the province averaged out as a whole. And that's something that's pressing. It's something that has been identified regularly in debates on the floor of this legislature. I would have hoped that the government would have turned its mind to a problem like that and perhaps brought in an initiative, brought in policies, brought in legislation, brought in something that we could deal with here that would show some leadership, some foresight, some attention to the problem with the thoroughness at least equivalent, and I would hope better, than that shown in their drafting of Bill 117. And think about poverty. Number of my colleagues have brought to the floor of this House issues around poverty. Energy poverty, homelessness, expensive homes, that is too expensive apartments, the lack of availability of community services in some neighborhoods, the community services system, the inadequacies of that. These are issues that are important to a huge number of Nova Scotians, and the continued existence of problems like that is a disgrace in our province. Canada is a rich nation. We don't have to have poverty. And the barriers to change are not lack of knowledge, and certainly not lack of wealth. People who study these things have told us for a long time how it is that a wealthy community like Canada could eliminate poverty. Has to do with education, has to do with support, has to do with long-range support, has to do with individualized support, has to do with dealing with families, particularly when focused on young people. There are a whole variety of well-established strategies out there that we can afford and that in many respects we can't afford not to invest in. But has this been the thrust of what the government has decided to be farsighted about? Nope. It isn't. I know in my office that we continue to hear from people who live in our constituency who are finding their circumstances so pressing and difficult, and the responses of the departments that are supposed to be dealing with them and their problems so inadequate that we feel ourselves some despair and somewhat overwhelmed and a little depressed. We continue to slog it out, but it would be nice if the government turned its mind to the problem and came along with us and tried to solve some of these problems in a far-sighted way. But that's not the case. And when it comes to the environment, it's not just a federal matter. It's not just something for the federal government. Responsibility for the environment, for sustainability, for thinking about the future and where we're going with our life support systems is something that's a provincial responsibility as much as it is federally. And this province is falling down on the job, especially when it comes to energy issues. But do we see main items central to the government's platform, central to what it's thinking about, central to what it's asking us to deal with, coming forward? No. Questions are asked in question period, as they were in the fall, about these issues. And it's clear that the government is taking a hands-off approach. They're standing aside and waiting for the leadership of the federal government. unnecessary and wrong. Instead of tackling that problem, along with an array of others, they've turned their minds to this particular issue, this question of political party financing, political party funding. And the list goes on. I mentioned workplace health and safety. I mentioned rural communities. These are things on which we've spoken before. We'll continue to speak. We'll continue to raise these issues. But I have to say that I'm at the very least disappointed. And I know Nova Scotians continue to be not just disappointed, but agitated and resentful when it sees its government failing to have an appropriate sense of priorities. And it's not as if something like this is an isolated event. It's not as if one bill happened to drift to the top of the pile. What Nova Scotians have assessed is the fact that the government doesn't have an appropriate sense of priorities at all. 1 year under a new premier has not been a huge amount of time. But I think for Nova Scotians, they're getting to feel it's been plenty, maybe more than enough. I think they feel they have a good grasp of what the sense of priorities of this government is. And this bill is one more illustration of a misplaced sense of priorities by this government. So this is exactly the first thing that's wrong with this bill, that the government is choosing to highlight it, that they're choosing to bring the full resources of their alliance with the third party to rush it through the House, that they're choosing to use their alliance with the third party to avoid extensive public scrutiny, that they used their alliance with the third party to hold hearings at the Law Amendments Committee late in December at a time when it could not reasonably be expected at all that informed and interested members of the public could come forward in the appropriate numbers and with a diversity of views that would be helpful to us as legislators. Nova Scotians have taken note of this, and they'll remember this, not as the only item on which the government demonstrates its failures, but as one of a cumulative list. I want to be clear that I and my colleagues have no objection to being here at an unusual January sitting. This is just fine. Several of us have complained on the record in the past about the relatively few number of days in the year in which we are called upon to sit. We're prepared to do the work. That isn't the issue. We're prepared to be here in the House. We're prepared to deal with legislation. We're prepared to debate policies. We're prepared to debate initiatives. We're prepared to engage with all of those things. That isn't the issue. The question is the choice of priorities. And I want to note that even though there's a minority government, the rules are that the government, even though a minority, still has control of the legislative agenda. They get to choose, in most instances, on most days, what it is that comes forward. Now, we've certainly taken our time to the maximum allotted amount during the course of this debate. We've done that because once the government chose to bring this bill forward and to focus on it and to say that we have to deal with it, we wanted to try to improve the bill if we possibly could, and to lay out our criticisms of this bill in detail so that the public would know the problems with it. Well, that is the first problem. First problem is that the government chose to highlight this bill rather than other topics that it could have been dealing with. What's the next problem? The next problem has to do with how it is that a terrible historical fact of political life in Nova Scotia has now received, or will receive, through this bill, the blessing of the government, the blessing of the legislature, the official approval of the House of Assembly of Nova Scotia if this bill goes through. And I'm referring, of course, to the Liberal Party trust funds. Everyone knows, or should know, the story of how this money came into the hands of the Liberal Party. My colleague from Halifax Fairview yesterday in the committee of the whole House laid out in detail the history of how it is that the bulk of the trust funds that are held by the Liberal Party came to be raised. And I hope he takes the occasion to repeat today, on third reading, where it'll be recorded and answered, what he said then. A number of us have read about this, thought about it, laid it out. And I'm going to do that again just briefly to remind us of what it is that the problem has to be seen to be. The Liberal Party, in times past, several decades ago, raised money through what is called toll gating. At a time when they were the government, they were in a position to extract from those seeking to do business with the government involuntary contributions to their party. Now, not only is such a practice clearly immoral, it's also contrary to a whole array of laws. And ultimately, some of the people involved in this scheme were prosecuted criminally, and several of them were either convicted or pleaded guilty. And to a certain extent, the facts came out. Now, the Liberal Party had accumulated significant numbers of dollars, several millions of dollars in that way. And the funds that the Liberal Party had as trust funds came primarily from that source. They came also from a source the origins of which are unknown. The best, perhaps, we will ever know about that, the origins of those funds that were not, apparently, from toll gating, might have been laid out in the memoirs of the lawyer Frank Covert in his book, My 50 Years at the Practice of Law. Mr. Covert was a stalwart of the Liberal Party of Nova Scotia for many years. He tells us some things about the origins of some of those funds. But mostly what he tells us about is who administered them. But it's not really that relatively smaller portion of the funds, the origins of which are murky, unknown, that I'm focused on. What I'm more concerned about is the funds that were raised through clearly illegal activities. The question becomes, why should a party be allowed to continue to rely on such funds? That money should simply be forfeit to the Crown. It should be forfeit to the public purse. It should go to the Minister of Finance and be part of the consolidated revenues of the province of Nova Scotia. That's the appropriate thing to to do with that money. And I cannot understand why it is that the third party continues to embrace those funds. I cannot understand why it is that the third party, even though members of that party internally have raised the issue with them at conventions, at some of their conventions from time to time, why it is that they continue to be so attached to these funds. For surely a mature modern party that has been in government as a majority, occasionally as a minority, is in a position to turn to its supporters amongst the public of Nova Scotia and say, we are now asking you on a voluntary basis for donations to help us out with our ongoing and electoral activities. And they could do that. It's what the rest of us do. But instead of relying exclusively on that initiative, they want to hold on to these trust funds. I was put in mind of the statement by St. Paul in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 10. The love of money is the root of all evil, St. Paul says. Now, it should be clear that it's not money itself that's the root of all evil, but the love of money, the attachment to money. And that, I think, is the dilemma that the Liberal Party has found itself caught up in. It's become attached to this money. It's not prepared to bring itself to the point of giving these funds up. This is a taint on the third party, but it's also a taint on the whole electoral process in Nova Scotia. And it would be a taint on anyone who voted in favor of legislation that gives the cloak of legality to that money. Never before has there been anything that has blessed the existence of these trust funds. Never before has there been a provision in our laws that said, we, the legislature of Nova Scotia, recognize that these trust funds are legitimate and can be used. But that's what's in this bill. That's one of the central provisions of this bill. It says that these trust funds can be used, albeit with differential purposes in election and non-election years, by the Liberal Party of the province of Nova Scotia. What a scandal. What a complete scandal. And why is that provision in this bill? Of what advantage is it in a government-sponsored bill to have such a provision? Clearly, it's not a partisan matter for the financial benefit of the Conservative Party of Nova Scotia. The exclusive party, the only party that will have a financial benefit as a result of such a provision, is the third party, the Liberal Party, which has such funds. So Nova Scotians are asking themselves, I ask you, I ask myself, why would the government include such a provision in the bill? Why would the government include such a provision in the bill that benefits the third party? Undoubtedly, there's a quid pro quo. Undoubtedly. Undoubtedly, this is part of the ongoing alliance that was worked out last summer between the government as a minority and the third party to prop it up. If there's any other possible explanation, I would like to hear it. None has been suggested. I don't think any could be suggested. This is, as I said, a scandal that has been of long standing in Nova Scotia and which is now going to taint the government. They've chosen to embrace something that has been notorious in Nova Scotia politics. They have taken onto themselves, through this bill, all of the wrongdoing of the third party, all of the historic wrongdoing of the third party. That's a high price to pay for staying in government. And what about the contemporary views of the leading lights of the third party? Do we know what they think about these trust funds? Do we know what the leadership candidates have to say about these trust funds? Not yet, we don't. Inside the sitting caucus of the third party right now, the 9 members, there are 2, perhaps 3 members who might be candidates for leadership of the party. We haven't heard one word yet from them, even though there are numerous occasions. There have been numerous occasions as we've been debating Bill 117 on which they could have stood up and said, we reject these trust funds, we are prepared to give them up. And indeed, they voted against amendments that we brought forward that could have resulted in the forfeiture of these monies to the Crown. That happened at Committee of the Whole House. So, and to the extent that any of the potential leadership candidates inside that caucus have commented, we only have the comments of the honourable member from Richmond from back in the fall when he raised a point of order with respect to some comments that were made by some of my colleagues. And in the course of his comments, he made a suggestion. In fact, I think he made a direct statement, more than a suggestion, that in his view, there was nothing wrong with the trust funds, that they'd been cleansed, that they'd been audited, and that they were legitimate funds. This is simply not the case. Simply not the case. There was never an audit. Those funds were never cleansed. The firm of auditors that had a look at the funds 20 years ago were very clear that they did not do an audit, that they were not asked to do an audit, and that in no respects could they say that these funds did not come from illegal activities. What they were able to say, what they were asked about, was how much money specifically could be allocated or assigned to the illegal activities of the 3 persons who were convicted criminally. They came up with a number, I believe it was $1.3 million. And so the Liberal Party did pay that amount out of the funds to the government of the day, to the government of Nova Scotia, to the public purse. As a starting point, that was certainly the right thing to do, but first, it wasn't enough, and second, there is no cloak of legality, no cloak of propriety that could possibly be woven out of the thin threads of that action by an accounting firm. That is not an accounting, that is not the blessing of an accountant's firm, not by any means. So that's the situation. It's a mess. It continues to be a mess. It continues to redound against the credit of the third party. And we don't know what it is that candidates for the leadership of that party think about it or are prepared to do about it, except by implication. And the clear implication of their continued support of Bill 117 in its present form indicates that they want to hold on to that money. They have attached themselves to that money, and they're latched onto it like a limpet to a rock, and they're not letting go. This is a serious mistake for them. It's a serious mistake politically for them, but it's simply wrong in terms of public morality. It's wrong in terms of good public policy. It's wrong no matter how you choose to categorize it or analyze it. Well, that's the next thing that's wrong with this bill, is that it purports to give the cloak of legality to these tainted funds. Let me turn to the next thing that's fundamentally wrong with this bill. This is that it includes continued reliance on contributions from corporations and unions. This is something which we in our party offered jointly with the other parties, of course, to give up. We were prepared to give up corporate and union contributions as part of electoral reform in Nova Scotia. But the other two parties, the government and its ally in the third party, would not do that. They would simply not do that. And the model that we proposed was essentially the federal government model. Because electoral reform is not unique here in Nova Scotia. It's been going on across Canada in different jurisdictions and at the federal level, and it goes on in other parts of the world all the time. And we know, if we know anything as a result of something like the Gomery inquiry, how messy relations between political parties and the private sector and those who seek benefits from government can be through the nexus of money. This is something to be guarded against in any democracy. When we look south of the border at the United States Congress, and we look at one of the most pressing public policy issues in the United States, that is the dismal state of their healthcare system, and we ask ourselves, why is it that Americans have not moved to the kind of single-payer, government-sponsored, national healthcare system that Canada enjoys? The answer is the economic influence of companies, private companies that are in the healthcare business in the United States over members of Congress. They exercise such financial influence over members of Congress that it has been in the past virtually impossible for even those members who have embraced reform of the healthcare system in the United States to move forward on that agenda. That's been the main barrier to change. I mention this as an example of one of the serious problems that can arise when people with deep pockets are allowed to continue to make contributions in large amounts to political parties that are in a position, or to individuals who are in a position to make decisions about public policy matters. Well, if we can see the mote in the eyes of others, perhaps we can see the beam in our own. This is a problem here as much as anywhere. And we offered the opportunity to get rid of it. We offered the opportunity to end corporate and union contributions. We said, we'll do it if you'll do it. Let's all do it. Let's all simply follow the federal model in Canada. The federal government has done this with legislation that governs the financing of the political parties at the national level. They've said, if there are contributions that are going to continue to be made, they can be made by individuals. Well, why not? Why not move to that basis? Is there some practical problem? Well, there might be a transition practical problem. It may take a while to move to a new system. It may take a couple of years, But any party that's serious about being involved in the political process knows how to organize itself so as to do fundraising. We can all meet the challenge of increasing our memberships. We can all computerize our systems if they aren't computerized already, but I'm sure they are. We can all get out and try to persuade more members to go on to PAC, the pre-authorized checking system for monthly support of our political parties. We can go around in election years and try and ask for more and extra amounts of money and so on. All of this can happen. And the governing party and the third party, their allies, are undoubtedly in a position to do it. We're trying it, we do it. We rely as much as we possibly can on individual donations. That's been our history. But we were prepared to move away from both union and corporate donations entirely. And we urged that on the government, even with a transition to help move away from that system. We urged it upon the other parties, and they wouldn't accept it. They simply would not accept it. Neither of those two parties, even though they purport to be engaged in electoral party financing reform, would not embrace that. And furthermore, and this brings me to my next point of criticism, when it comes to the amounts that they are prepared to receive, they've set the limits very high. And this really forces us to ask the question, what is the nature of this so-called reform? What is the essence of what it is that Bill 117 does? If this is a reform bill, if this is a bill that tries to improve electoral party financing, what does it actually do? Well, really, all it does is it caps contributions at the $5,000 level, and it says that political parties will also be able to get funding out of the public purse depending on the number of votes they get. And furthermore, it's retroactive based on the number of votes you got in the 2006 election. That's the essence of this reform. Is this reform? This isn't reform. This is a self-serving grab. Our attempts all throughout this process, at second reading, at Law Amendments Committee, in Committee of the whole House, has been to try to take what is a self-serving bill put forward by a minority government that's worried about its future, supported by its ally, the third party, which is so petrified of the next election that they're prepared to prop up a government which has been beset by disasters month after month for a full year. That's what this bill is about. It's self-serving for both of those parties. And one of the examples of the ways in which that's done is by keeping the contribution limit high. It looks like reform, but it isn't. It's another example of fast food government. Kind of looks like the real thing, but it isn't. And I think Nova Scotians have understood this. I know that Nova Scotians have many other preoccupations, and I started out by listing what they are, and I think that they're much more important than electoral party financing. But it has not failed to come to the attention of Nova Scotians what it is that the government is trying to do with this legislation. Let me turn now to the next aspect of a difficulty with this bill. I mentioned it in passing just a moment ago, and it's that in some sense this bill is retroactive. It's retroactive not in the sense that it goes back to previous years and previous elections extensively, but what it does is this, is it says that out of the public purse, political parties will be paid a certain amount per vote, commencing January 1st, 2007. So if this bill goes through this week, technically it'll be retroactive to 10 days or 12 days ago. That's not my main point. My main point is that the trigger mechanism for entitlement to being paid out of the public purse is how well the political parties did in the last election. In other words, the government says, and this is probably part of its attempt to, and thinking that they might have induced support from the official opposition, they say, folks, let's look at how well we all did in the 2006 election, and now let's pay ourselves, pay our political parties based on what we already know. That is not the way to do electoral finance reform. If electoral finance reform is going to take place, it should take place prospectively. You should say the following thing. You should say, here's a new system of funding political parties, and you know what? It will go into effect after the next election. That's the case if there's going to be public financing of political parties. If there is going to be public funding of political parties, then that's the way to do it, because you let everyone know what the new system is going to be. That means that political parties out there that want to get themselves organized or may have become moribund get the chance to put forward their ideas in the marketplace of politics. I think that's the right way to do it, if that's going to happen. Instead, the government is saying, oh, look, we got 160,000 votes in the 2006 election. Guess we'll just kind of use the public purse to pay ourselves $1.50 per vote. Won't that be nice? Not the right thing to do, in my opinion. That's another example of being, I think, self-serving. But now, let me look at one other aspect, and this is an associated aspect of the last point. And this is the question of whether there should even be public financing for political parties. Political parties are an important part of democracy. But I'm far from convinced that there should be public funding of political parties. And I want to table an item. It's from an article in the Sunday Times, that is the UK's Sunday Times, from October 22nd of 2006. It's an article by a man named Michael Pinto-Dushinsky. It's called "It's Their Party and We Pay for It." This author, who is identified as, quote, the world's leading authority on party finance, end of quote. He is described as someone who has, quote, advised the UN and several governments, end quote. Mr. Michael Pinto-Dushinsky says in his article, yes, parties have important functions in a democracy, only insofar as they represent members of the public. By making them even more dependent upon state funding, they automatically become less democratic. End of quote. Now, the opinion he offers that reliance upon state funding automatically makes parties less democratic is one that I happen to share. If I had my druthers, I don't think there should be public financing of political parties except as a transition measure. That is to say, it could be temporary. It could be short-term, perhaps a year or two, if there was a shift from an old system to a new system. If there were electoral party finance reform, so as to eliminate corporate and union donations, so as to severely limit the dollar amount, and we've taken the position that it should be reduced from $5,000 to perhaps $1,000, then as a transition measure, there might be indeed some government, that is to say, taxpayer dollar, support for political parties on a temporary transition basis. I'm aware that not all members of either my caucus or this House agree with that position. But I put it out because it's what I happen to think, and second, it seems to me an important point, and based on the item I read into the record a moment ago, it is not without support and thoughtful support elsewhere. So I'm concerned about that. I'm not convinced that this is the right thing to do by any means, but there it is. Let me point out the next difficulty. Except with respect to the use of the third parties' trust funds, this statute does not make any distinction in its thinking between the funding needs of a political party from year to year and the funding needs of a political party in an election year. Seems to me that unless we're assuming that we're on a permanent election footing, which is a possible way to think in a minority government situation, we should consider election years in a different way. One of the things that probably should have been included in this bill was a differentiation when it comes to election years. There should have been special recognition that election years entail extraordinary expenditures for political parties well beyond the normal run of things. So I think that is also something of a flaw here. I don't regard it as such a fundamental flaw that it would, if it were the only problem, lead to rejection of the bill. But it's a way in which this bill could have been improved. So there are quite a number of problems with this bill. Now I want to turn finally to one that so far has not been officially identified in the debates, although I did mention it when we were in Committee of the Whole House. And it has to do with the core provision in the bill that has to do with the triggers for eligibility for government funding. This has to do with the financing arrangements when the money is to come from the public purse. And you will recall that the trigger mechanism is one that includes a barrier that is tied to percentage of vote gathered. Now, the trouble with that is that it is of dubious constitutional legality. There is a Charter of Rights problem with a trigger like that. And I predict that what will happen is that if this bill is adopted and keeps within it, as now seems inevitable, that trigger provision, including the percentage hurdle that's specified, that there will be litigation against the government of Nova Scotia. That provision of the bill will be challenged. And it will be challenged under Section 3 of the Charter of Rights, the right to vote provision. Perhaps also under Section 15, but it will certainly be challenged. And I predict that the result will be that the litigants, any political party that has run candidates in the past, will be successful in finding themselves to be eligible for public funding. And I don't wish to endorse a bill that includes such a provision. Such a provision should not have been in the bill. And it's not just on the basis of my casual reading of this bill that I say this. There is litigation, there is jurisprudence, there are rulings of the courts in Canada that support what I'm saying. Indeed, the most recent decision of the courts in Canada is the Longley case in Ontario, decided just in October. When I became aware of that decision, shortly after it came down, I found the decision, supplied it to some of the individuals in our own caucus who supplied it to the government. So the government has known since the time of second reading of this bill of the Longley decision, if they actually needed that decision, because there were predecessor decisions. For example, the Supreme Court of Canada decision in the Figueroa case. In both of those cases, the Canada Elections Act was attacked because of provisions that had triggers in them for eligibility, relating to eligibility for public financing that related either to the number of candidates run in an election or the percentage of votes that were obtained by a political party. In other words, a barrier had been introduced. A barrier, according to the courts, that favored the more established parties and disadvantaged other political parties. Now, I want to say that I don't regard myself as having a mandate for any of the other political parties, but I am ashamed to be asked to vote for a bill that purports to make our system more democratic when it contains within it, at its heart, at the heart of the provisions in this bill, something that violates the Charter. Couldn't vote for something like that. As a matter of the ethics of my profession, I couldn't vote for something like that. In terms of my integrity as an MLA, I couldn't vote for something like that. And as a practical matter, I can't imagine why it is that the government would want to pass a bill, why it would want to introduce a bill, and then force upon us a bill in company with its ally in the third party that is going to result in a lawsuit. Probably next week. It's entirely predictable that this will happen. Now, this is simply wrong. Shouldn't happen. It's easy to read these cases. It's easy to see that the Section 3 Charter of Rights provision that says there's a right to vote has been understood by the courts in a very expansive way. They've said that the right to vote doesn't just relate to going into a ballot box and putting your mark against the name of some individual. What the courts have said is that the right to vote is a basic democratic matter on which the courts are prepared to consider a wide range of issues, and they have engaged on examination of things like where electoral boundaries are drawn. And in the context of party financing, they have looked at issues around barriers to entry to the system. And nothing could be clearer than that the right to vote, as enunciated in cases like Figueroa and the Longley decision, call into question the core provision in our legislation that has to do with public financing, because it offers it on an unequal basis. Well, there we have it. Mr. Speaker, whether it's an objection based on the sense of priorities, whether it's an objection based on the third party's trust funds, whether it's an objection based on the clear self-serving nature of this bill, whether it's an objection based on the fact that it's retroactive in making it therefore additionally self-serving, whether it's an objection based on the violation of Section 3 and probably Section 15 of the Charter of Rights, I can't support this bill. All of this individually and cumulatively makes it something that should clearly be rejected by this House. There is a wide array of reasons why we end up in the position we do, namely non-supportive of this bill. I can't understand why the government persists with this. We have offered them moment after moment throughout the process the opportunity to back away from this, to make what purported to be a reform measure a true reform measure, something that would really add to the democracy of our political life in Nova Scotia, and they have passed by every opportunity. Every opportunity has been passed by. Mr. Speaker, At the beginning, I noted that I hadn't had the opportunity to speak to this bill at second reading. I regret not having had that opportunity, but I've appreciated having had the chance today to put on record at third reading my thoughts on this bill and an explanation of why it is that I simply cannot and will not support it. So I thank you for your attention.
Thank you. The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to say that I'm very pleased to have an opportunity to enter into the debate at third reading on Bill 117. It's interesting, particularly following on the speech that was just made by my colleague, the member from Halifax Chebucto, to see that this is an issue that people care about, and it has many, many different aspects in terms of points of view, even within caucuses, I think. We don't always share entirely the same ideas about the impact of changing the campaign financing and what that will mean. And I think in some ways it's because we don't really know until we've tried something out. And I would like to talk a bit in the time that I have here about my thoughts on public financing for political parties, because I see things slightly differently than the honourable member who just spoke. However, I'm certainly very open to be persuaded by his point of view, and I would be very interested in knowing more about the distinguished expert that he made reference to from Great Britain, who has no doubt looked at this with more detail than I certainly have had an opportunity to. I want to start at the outset by saying, Mr. Speaker, that like so many other things this government has done, I think Bill 117 has been rather poorly conceived and certainly very poorly executed. It's not a piece of legislation I wish to be associated with, and I will not be supporting this bill when it comes to a vote, either at the end of the interventions by members in this chamber. And Mr. Chair, I say this, or Mr. Speaker, I say this with some regret. I have been in this place now for close to 9 years, and I have voted both for and against various bills, but there are few other bills that I could not support that I have found so fundamentally repugnant as Bill 117. Maybe Bill 68. Yes, the member from Richmond asks about Bill 68, and I found that quite repugnant, as I did the legislation removing the right to strike for paramedics. But Mr. Speaker, it's because those pieces of legislation went to the fundamental rights of members of our province with respect to collective bargaining. And this is a bill of significant consequence to the political system in the province of Nova Scotia. And it's a bill that I think has been demonstrated by the debate, through the debate and through the analysis as being flawed, as being unbalanced and unfair, certainly to one of the political parties in this province, namely the New Democratic Party, and that's widely understood and widely accepted now. And it also is not in harmony with the federal government's recent Accountability Act, which also overhauled the federal system of funding for political parties. And I think an opportunity was missed here with this bill. But, Mr. Speaker, I want to talk a bit more about what a good bill would look like. If we were here in this place to bring forward real reform of financing for political parties, what would it look like? Well, it could look like the federal legislation. It could be a process, a new set of rules that would reduce to zero contributions from corporations and contributions from trade unions, or indeed any other organization that is not a citizen. And the principle that we would be adopting in the province of Nova Scotia for the financing of political parties would indeed be a principle that says that political party contributions will come from the citizens of the province who have the franchise to vote in elections and hold membership in a political party and participate in that way. And this is what the Federal Accountability Act essentially has done. And it would be the proper thing to do here. It, in fact, is the position that has been taken in many other provinces across this country. And it would put us in that league rather than leave us yet again lagging behind. And I think contributing to a perception not only in this province, but outside the province, that we politically in Nova Scotia are a bit of a backwater, Mr. Speaker. And I don't like to say that because I care a lot about the image of our province, and I'm like most other Nova Scotians, I guess the hair rises on the back of my neck when I hear from people who aren't from our province ridicule our province, and they generally do it based on their impression of our politics and our politicians, and the fact that we still haven't grown up politically in this province and matured to the point where we can conduct ourselves in a more ethical and upright manner. And so we've missed an opportunity with this legislation, as we so often do, I think, as this government so often does, in the kind of manner in which they lurch from crisis to crisis. Mr. Speaker, we would, if we were really reforming the financing of political parties, we would move far beyond that one change. We would also require that contributions that are made in leadership campaigns be fully disclosed and that they be subjected to the same rules as the rules that exist in a general election, that there be contributions that would be made from individuals, from citizens with the franchise, living within the province, and that they be subjected to limits. We failed again during the process of amending Bill 117 to endorse amendments that were brought forward by the NDP caucus to, in fact, place in this bill those kinds of limitations for contributions during a leadership campaign and full disclosure. in a timely fashion in a leadership campaign. Now, this is a very important point because the people who ultimately succeed in those campaigns are people who are a fundamental part of the political system. And I think that the people in the province of Nova Scotia have a right to know, they're entitled to know, and they certainly want to know who has been bankrolling the leadership campaigns of various candidates for a political party. So that's a change I think that we should be making, and I want to say that I'm very disturbed that there was no support from either the Liberal caucus or the government caucus, the Tory caucus, for this particular change, which also, Mr. Speaker, I understand is a piece of the Federal Accountability Act. And when I had an opportunity to speak in Committee of the Whole, I pointed out that on some level, this whole process of reforming the federal set of rules governing the financing of political parties came out of the dispute between John Chrétien and Paul Martin, when Paul Martin was raising money through his very strong connections with corporate Canada during, even before a leadership campaign had been announced at the federal government level. And the Prime Minister Chrétien at the time was not very happy, and he was particularly unhappy that people such as Brian Tobin and John Manley and other fairly capable and prominent members of the Liberal Party were starting to openly question whether or not they had any hope of mounting a credible campaign to lead that party in the event that the Prime Minister, and everybody knew that Prime Minister Chrétien was going to be leaving fairly soon. And this is what started that particular process going. And of course, Stephen Harper, Prime Minister Harper, has taken those beginning reforms at the federal level, started by the former Prime Minister Chrétien, and has moved them even further along. Mr. Speaker, there's something else that is already a principle that is entrenched in our current set of rules that a piece of Bill 117 violates. In our current system of party financing, it is required by law right now that all money received by a political party, every bit of money received from a political party, has to be identified in terms of where that money came from. And, you know, this is unlike the days when money could be received by a political party. There was no tracking of where it came from, who had given it. Those days have not existed for some considerable time. And there is this principle that we all accept is a very important principle, is that political parties should not be receiving money whose origins is not specific. And this, I think, is the part of Bill 117 that troubles me the most, Mr. Speaker. It's the fact that We know that the Liberal Party of Nova Scotia has trust funds whose origins cannot be determined, have not been determined, and yet this bill with Section 21 very specifically legitimates the use of those funds by the Liberal Party of Nova Scotia, except for a very narrow window that can be as short as 30 days every 5 years. And Mr. Speaker, that's reprehensible in my view. It's not supportable, and it's extremely puzzling to me why any member of the government caucus would find that to be an acceptable and such a fundamental part of this particular piece of legislation. No money whose origins cannot be determined should be a part of any money for political parties for their operation on any level. And last night when I had a chance in committee to talk on this, on the amendments, I talked about all of the places that we could use those funds, and what the position of the NDP caucus is that the proper disposal of those funds are to go back to the Crown, the province of Nova Scotia. My colleagues have laid out very clearly why what the history of those trust funds are, and why turning this money back to the people of Nova Scotia, from where much of that money came, would be the right thing to do, Mr. Chair, or Mr. Speaker. So real reform of campaign funding would, as I've said, it would eliminate corporate and union donations. It would only allow citizens to be contributors to political parties through campaign financing. It would set limits on how much citizens can, in fact, donate. It would be the same set of rules that exist at the federal level, so there would be harmonization between that system. There would be no money in any political party's coffers that cannot be traced or determined what the source of that money is. And, Mr. Speaker, not only in my view should there be limits set on contributions to political parties from individuals, but I think we really need to engage in a debate about limits on spending in an election. And, you know, this particular idea is my idea. It's not necessarily one that the NDP caucus has adopted. We are engaged in a process of talking about the various ideas for electoral party reform and things that can be done to improve the democratic process. And this particular idea is one of my hobby horses. And I think, you know, I first ran for election in, the first time I ran was in 1988. No, 1984. It was 1984. So that wasn't yesterday, Mr. Speaker. That's right, 1984. The member from Richmond probably wasn't born then. And he certainly wouldn't have been too old at that time. But I wasn't too old at that time either. I was in my 20s, and it was when I look back on it, you know, I think about how campaigns were at that point in Nova Scotia. It was rare to see billboards in the province. of the leaders. That was very rare, even of the more established parties, parties that were more established than the NDP. Television advertising at that time, in fact, there was television advertising, obviously, but it was nothing close to the saturation we have now. The greatest, I think, means for political parties to campaign and to communicate their message back in the 80s was through radio and through the daily newspapers and the local newspapers, and doing campaign events, and the leaders moving around the province and holding daily media announcements. And while all of that, while all of those things continue, the increase in technology and the astronomical change, I think, in the kinds of communications, and we're living in an information and a communications age, has really contributed to quite a significant growth in the cost of the cost and the complexity of electoral campaigns. And many people complain that we may be bombarded with commercials and billboards and what have you, but they find that the substance of our electoral politics has become less meaningful, more superficial, simplistic, some people say vacuous. Political parties, their leaders, their platforms, their messages are harder to distinguish, and there's been criticism that the cult of personality has displaced the substance of the strength of character and the strength of ideas, and that balance that's required to adequately run a government and to serve the people of the province. And there are many people who would like to see us return to a more, a simpler campaign style that is formed by ideas and policy issues, and not necessarily by the technology. So, if we were going to really reform the financing of political parties, in my mind, these are the elements that we would be looking at. Mr. Speaker, I, as you today during question period, listened intently to the exchange that was happening here on the floor, and I was puzzled, you know, Mr. Speaker, during question period, when the Premier had an opportunity to answer some probing questions, he indicated that he wanted to focus on issues that matter to Nova Scotians, and he talked about what some of those issues were. He talked about hog farming and jobs and the economy, and I agree with him. I agree with him fully. But what puzzles me is, if these are the issues that this government wants to talk about, then why on earth have they called us into a special winter session where none of those issues are on their agenda? Where the only issue that's on their agenda is getting public money into the coffers of the government party, is protecting the trust funds of the Liberal Party in law and legislation, and introducing legislation that has an unfair element in terms of the official opposition. I'm very puzzled by the Premier's logic in terms of the response he gave to some of the questions in question period. And that particular response and the reality that's happening here. It seems to be somewhat incongruent, and it doesn't reflect the reality that this legislature, in fact, wasn't called back to deal with those issues. This legislature was called back to deal with one piece of legislation, Bill 117, a piece of legislation that we could have dealt with back in November. You know, it is troubling and it is puzzling, the mixed messages that we get from the government and from the Premier. Mr. Speaker, I want to talk a bit about Bill 117 with respect to the public money that political parties, including my own party, will receive. Mr. Speaker, first of all, I think in a way it's a bit of a misnomer to, if people are left with the impression that political parties have no public money now, then in a way they're wrong. We don't get money directly from the public purse now, but we certainly do indirectly. There is right now a public benefit to making a contribution to political parties, and there has been for some time. In third reading, or in committee of the whole, I made reference to the fact that I thought that the political tax contribution system was an element that was introduced into our political system, I think at a federal level first. It was something that was negotiated, as I understand it, as I recall, during a minority government when the NDP held the balance of power federally. And I was saying yesterday that I thought it was when Ed Broadbent was the leader, but in retrospect, I think it was when David Lewis, in fact, was the leader of the federal NDP, David Lewis being the father of Stephen Lewis. And what that meant was that individuals and organizations that made contributions to political parties would get a tax benefit, a tax credit for those contributions. So, for example, Mr. Speaker, right now, pre-Bill 117, if in the province of Nova Scotia, somebody makes a $100 contribution to the Liberal Party or the Conservative Party or the NDP, they, in fact, it's like donating $25 rather than $75, because if they have a taxable income, they get a $75 tax credit, which might mean a rebate, or it might mean that the tax that they have to pay is reduced by $75. And what that means is the provincial treasury is out by $75. So in a way, political parties have been getting public money through the tax system for quite a number of years now. That benefit is already well entrenched. And, you know, many people don't know about it, but people who are active in political parties know about it, and it's certainly something we tell people when we have an election and we're out raising money and we're asking people to make contributions to our campaigns. We say, and do you know about the tax benefit? Do you know about the political contribution rules? If you give a $100 donation, 75% of that is you will receive as a tax credit when you file your income tax. And this is something that many people, they think, gee, you know, I can give $25. That's not a big problem. If I'm going to have a $75 tax credit against my provincial income tax, then, so we already have a system where the public subsidizes political contributions. So it's not a direct, it's an indirect way of supporting financially the political party structure, but it's, it's there. And this bill doesn't change that. In fact, what this bill does is it expands the limit on which you can get a tax credit. It raises the ceiling at which you can get a credit. So the political parties will financially benefit greatly, not only from the tax credits or from the public money, but they will substantially benefit from the shift in the credits that are available. Now, some people think, and my colleague who spoke before me raised concerns that he has, that public money will contribute to less accountability and less democracy in our system. And I have to say, I certainly hope that that's not the case. And this is something I think we need to monitor very closely. Because if it is the case, we need to be prepared to address that. It's my hope that alternatively, people will feel more empowered to hold the political parties more accountable, because the public money that's coming to political parties is now so directly coming and not coming in the back door through the tax credit system. You rarely get a constituent or a member of the public calling you up and saying, look, you're accountable to me because there's a tax credit system in this province that funds your political party. And so I think you better pay attention to what I have to say. Because people don't understand that that system's in place. But they will understand, and I hope they'll understand, and I'll make a commitment in my limited sphere of influence to let people know that they're funding the political parties in this province now, and that as people who are taxpayers and are funders of our system, they really need to take advantage of whatever power that puts in their hands to say, you need to pay attention to me now because, your funding comes directly through me. I don't know that that will be the case. The member from Halifax-Chebucto, who is a very well-read person, has brought to our attention that certainly in the UK, a British expert who has looked at political party funding has raised concerns about it, and I think we need to be, prepared to have a very open mind around this and to evaluate the impact of this. But at the same time, I think it would be very good if in fact this did contribute in some way to a more robust system of accountability and people holding political parties accountable. Sometimes people, with great justification, I'm sure, would like to see the abolition of the political party system. I obviously have a vested interest in a political party system, being a member of a party and having been involved for many years, and it's my intention to stay involved at some level for probably many more years to come, whatever that level might be. It's been said, Mr. Speaker, as you know, that as flawed as our democratic system and institutions are, they're still better than the alternative of not having a democratic system. And I think in spite of whatever our differences around various issues in this chamber, whatever those differences might be, we are all Democrats in that we all believe in the democratic process. I'm I'm very proud to be a social democrat in the tradition of J.S. Woodsworth and Tommy Douglas, Stanley Knowles, David Lewis, you know, Ed Broadbent, who has devoted a considerable period of his life to looking at democratic reform and ways to strengthen the democratic system. And he's written extensively on things like campaign reform. So, Mr. Speaker, these are not inconsequential matters. They're important matters, and although they may not be, nor should they be, the number one priority when there are so many other things that are pressing and important to people in their daily lives, we deviate from paying attention to the elements of our democratic system at our own peril. And I don't mean in a personal way. I mean at the peril of a society that we live in, that we're very privileged to live in. I mean, we all watch the news, Mr. Speaker, and we see Somalia, we see Afghanistan, we see Iraq, we see so many places around the globe where people are living in agony daily with leadership that is despotic, that is autocratic, that is sadistic in some cases, that has no respect for or no knowledge of what it would really mean to be in a democracy. There are no human rights. There are very little economic rights. Women are at great disadvantage. They receive no education. They're, in some cases, not allowed to participate in the democratic system at all. So, I mean, there are so many reasons we have to be very grateful for the democratic system that we have. But that doesn't mean we should be complacent and think that we have it made. We don't have it made. We have a long way to go. And Bill 117, I think, demonstrates that. It demonstrates that there are still many things that can be done to change a piece of legislation that has some significant weaknesses. Mr. Speaker, I was at the Law Amendments Committee when, shortly before Christmas, there were some presentations on the bill. It was interesting. The leader of the Federation of Labor, the Nova Scotia Federation of Labor, Rick Clark, made a very good presentation at the Law Amendments Committee. I think the member from Richmond is agreeing with me that he did make a very good presentation. And he indicated that the Federation of Labor would be fully in support of changes in electoral financing in the province of Nova Scotia, which would see the elimination of union contributions to political parties. And he spoke at length in terms of how else they might use fairly limited resources for other very, very good causes that can make a significant difference in the lives of the working women and men in this province, unionized or not unionized. We know that we have, as a province, as a country really, a fight on our hands to maintain a public health care system. The forces that would see privatization as a profitable endeavor have been chomping at the bit to get at the public health care system pretty much ever since the Medicare system came into being. And this is a a fight that is very much in the interests of the working people in this country. And I'm sure organizations like the trade union movement, the unions in the province, and let's be clear, Medicare was largely won because of the efforts of organizations within the trade union movement. The reason we have a Medicare system comes out of the history of the struggle of the labor movement in this country. So I'm sure they would be able to use their resources to continue the efforts to maintain public Medicare. At the same time, I think, Mr. Speaker, I've read in the business columns, in the certainly in the Chronicle Herald, various commentators have indicated that the corporate sector in the province of Nova Scotia would be more than happy to see Bill 117 in a different form, in the form that the NDP wanted, which was to make sure that there were no corporate donations. You know, corporations are, as everybody here knows, in a very, very tight competitive environment. And their resources, although some people might think they're unlimited, they're not unlimited. Their resources also need to be used prudently and need to be targeted and need to be invested wisely. And there are many people who work hard and do due diligence in the corporate sector who would like nothing better than to see the elimination of corporate donations. So you have these two entities, the trade union movement and the corporations in the province, looking at this legislation, looking at the amendments that the NDP brought forward in support of them, yet you have the two old parties in this province, and some people would say the old tired parties in this province, unprepared to let go of the status quo. And that, Mr. Speaker, is puzzling in terms of the stated objectives of this legislation, and the minister saying that it's about democratic renewal and change and restoring some faith in the political process. The other thing about this process, and I said at the beginning, was how flawed the actual process of bringing forward this bill is. The last day that the House sat in November, the Minister of Finance brought forward a resolution to talk about democratic reform and the establishment of an all-party committee to report back to this House in June, I believe. We haven't heard a squeak out of the government since then with regard to that committee. Yet here we are putting the final commas and touches into Bill 117 before its passage, and we don't even have that all-party committee struck. It seems to be a quite odd process in that we'll have the legislation probably passed and proclaimed before the work that really was required to go before this legislation has even started. And I'm certainly wondering what that whole thing was all about, that particular proposal from the government. It doesn't really make a great deal of sense. Mr. Speaker, I don't have a whole lot more that I want to say with respect to this bill. I did, when we had a chance to talk in the Committee of the Whole, I did have an opportunity to talk about the places that the Liberal trust funds, the money in the Liberal trust funds could be used. that would be of great benefit to the people of the province, and I would like to restate that here on the record, given that the debate in Committee of the Whole is not on the record. The Ham government eliminated 2 programs that I'm increasingly convinced were low-budget items that provided a great benefit to the people of this province. The Criminal Injuries Compensation Program. I had a resolution here in the legislature this morning on the Criminal Injuries Compensation Program, and asking that the Minister of Justice be encouraged to have a look at bringing that program back. And the government caucus nayed that resolution. And it's a shame, because this was a program that compensated the victims of violent crime for the costs that were associated as a result of being assaulted. Most other provinces in the country have criminal injuries compensation program of this nature. It was a program that for which there was never an expenditure of more than approximately $400,000 annually. There would be roughly maybe 400 applicants each year to the program, or recipients from the program. 70% of those recipients were often women, particularly women who were assaulted. Well, my colleague from Dartmouth East asked me if children as well, and yes, children as well were recipients of. There is a report at the Department of Justice website that is the last report of the Criminal Injuries Compensation Program in 1998-99. It's got a lovely little pie chart that shows who the various categories of applicants were: children, women, the nature of the assaults, the kinds of, and it was really a very important program. It was paid for it was paid for exclusively out of fines that people pay when they're charged with, summary offenses in the province of Nova Scotia. So it was a program that is, sort of self-supporting in terms of the revenue. And so the cancellation of this program is troubling, and it's one I think we need to continue to encourage the government to bring back. Certainly $3.4 million, or however many millions that are in the Liberal Trust funds going to the Crown, could go a long way to support a criminal injuries compensation program. And there would be something deliciously ironic about taking the Liberal Trust Fund's monies and using them for criminal injuries compensation, I would suggest. Yes, it could be ironic. The other program that I spoke of was the Family Violence Prevention Initiative. And this was even a program that cost less than the Criminal Injuries Compensation Program. It was roughly, I think, $200,000, $250,000 a year. It was a small office in the Department of Community Services. It served as a clearinghouse for information on the best practices around family violence from across the country and outside of the country. Every week in February, we would have Family Violence Prevention Week. It would be a week of public information, and it was an office that also gave advice to government on public policy with respect to, child abuse, wife abuse, various forms of violence in the context of a family. This is gone now, and I think, particularly given the number of deaths of women in domestic violence situations in the province of Nova Scotia over the last year and a half, the government really does need to re-examine how successful their current regime of program is and services are for for women in these living in these situations, and it's my view that we need to do more, and certainly the Liberal Party trust funds could go a long way towards supporting a program like that. Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure how much more time I have. 10 more minutes. And thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I probably won't take the entire 10 minutes, although I will come close. Mr. Speaker, I've said here before that while the system we have has its flaws, it's still better than the alternative of not having a system. That, like it or not, the political party system is the cornerstone of the democratic system that we have. I don't want to speak disparagingly of colleagues in another level of government, but I have to say I watch municipal politics sometimes with great interest, but also with sort of incredulous interest. And I tell people that I sometimes come back to Province House and kiss the ground when I enter Province House after being at HRM Council sometime. And I think, yeah, I like the political party system a lot better than this every person for themselves kind of system, which I'm not convinced gives you a better quality of government. Mr. Speaker, the political party system that we have is one that we need to give consideration to supporting if we want to improve our democracy. That it's very expensive for an individual to financially succeed, or an individual to succeed politically if they don't have independent means financially. A person of modest means would find this process daunting and very difficult to be successful in. And political parties, to some extent, are a collective, a way of helping individuals across a wide spectrum of means participate, and I believe that's the right thing to happen. Mr. Speaker, you probably might be aware, maybe not, we were all so busy in the last election it's hard to keep track of what's happening in everybody's particular riding, but in the last election, one of my opponents, the candidate for the Liberal Party, I think on the day that he announced his intention to run in the constituency of Halifax-Needham, announced that if he was elected, he would be donating all of his MLA salary to charity, and there was a great deal of public interest through the media in that particular. How did that work out for him? In that particular announcement. Well, he came in third place in a constituency where many people felt that that particular announcement would give him perhaps an advantage because there are so many deserving organizations and a substantial mass of the constituency, people who live in poverty or who are of modest means. And some people felt that that would be seen as an inducement to support this candidate. But I think obviously it didn't turn out that way. However, you know, it raises questions. There's a particular concrete situation that would be worth discussing and debating as part of electoral reform. Is this something that should be properly allowed in an election campaign? Should individual candidates be able to say, elect me and I will donate $70,000, $80,000 to the food bank I hear the member from King's, one of the King's West, say something about the CAW, donate it to the CAW. I'm not sure what that means. Given that no member of the Liberal Party has taken the opportunity to stand up and make one sentence of intervention on this bill, I find it puzzling that none of those members over there have stood up to say what they think should occur in the political reform system. No, I don't think they want to share their views publicly. But they won't be able to get away with that forever, Mr. Speaker, as you know. But, Mr. Speaker, I was saying, you know, this is a point that's worth having a discussion about. I think right now in our electoral rules, it would be a breach of our rules for any member or any candidate to offer or make a financial contribution to an organization or individual that would be seen as an inducement for their support. That's not allowed during an election. In fact, we've been cautioned that during an election you cannot be giving financial contributions to organizations and groups and individuals in your constituency. And so does the idea of saying, elect me and I will donate $5,000 to the art gallery, $10,000 to the music festival, $20,000 here, all of my salary, how would that fit into electoral campaign reform, Mr. Speaker? This is why we really should have had a different process for this bill. We should have had the process off the Select Committee. We should have gathered information about what the federal rules are. We should have looked at the desires of organizations like the unions and like the corporate sector to no longer be placed in a position where they feel they have to support political parties so that they have connections and perhaps influence at a time when they might need it in their particular issue or sector. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased that we were able to get some small changes in the bill. We were able to secure a change that means that no longer will Crown corporations be able to contribute to political parties. This party was not very happy to see the World Trade and Convention Center making contributions to political parties in the province. That is an organization that is a public Crown corporation, and the money they're passing out to political parties is not their money. It belongs to the people of the province. And so this is a good change. There were no limits placed on the age of people who can make contributions to political parties, and I think that was unfortunate that didn't happen. But these are kind of minor points, Mr. Speaker. So I know my time is at hand. Those are the things that I wanted to say. I will not be supporting this bill when it comes to a vote. And I like my colleague who spoke before me, feel somewhat ashamed that this legislation is here at all for this debate. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Queens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To stand here and speak to Bill 117, the third reading of Bill 117, well, it's been a long week. And as we all know, we were here in the fall session speaking to Bill 117. When I received notice that the House would resume for the sole purpose of moving forward, or the want to move forward this piece of legislation, one of my questions was, what else will we be doing in the House? What other business will we be looking at? What other business will the government be moving forward on? And the answer was, there is no other business except for this particular piece of legislation dealing with electoral reform. But we all know this week we did see other issues raised in this House, issues that weren't, issues brought up by us, but certainly other issues that weren't so great to be dealing with here in this House for the time that we've been here. I guess, you know, I was really disappointed to also hear